the dangerous illusion of absolute certainty. The first and perhaps most invisible sign of a fool is his need to be certain always. He doesn't just believe he's right, he needs to be. He speaks with the conviction of someone who has never dared to doubt himself, never paused long enough to sit with uncertainty, and that's precisely what makes him dangerous. While the wise man hesitates before speaking, knowing that truth is complex, evolving, and layered, the fool jumps in first, armed with opinions dressed up as facts and a voice louder than his understanding. His certainty is not strength, it's a shield, a defense mechanism to avoid the discomfort of not knowing. Because to admit ignorance, to say "I don't know," would be to crack the fragile mirror he holds up to the world. He doesn't seek truth, he seeks comfort. And in that comfort, he trades depth for delusion. You'll see it in how he argues not to understand but to dominate, not to listen but to silence. He repeats borrowed phrases, clings to inherited beliefs, and wraps himself in ideas he never dared to challenge, because if those ideas fall apart, so does he. Machiavelli understood this clearly. The most rigid minds are the most easily manipulated. Because when you're too certain to question yourself, anyone who sounds confident can control you. Certainty, when it becomes a performance, is no longer a virtue, it's a trap. True intelligence lives in the ability to say, "I could be wrong." The fool will never say that. And so with every word he utters, he doesn't reveal his knowledge, he reveals his fear. His loud voice is not proof of strength. It is the echo of a mind too afraid to listen. When being right becomes an addiction. The second sign of a fool is not just that he thinks he's right, it's that he needs to be. Every conversation becomes a battlefield, every disagreement a personal attack. He doesn't argue to discover the truth, he argues to win. He doesn't listen to understand, he listens only for his turn to speak. His ego is so fragile that the mere suggestion he might be wrong feels like a threat to his very existence. And so he fights not with clarity, but with noise. When logic begins to slip, he raises his voice. When facts fail, he shifts the subject, mocks the opposition, or claims to be the victim. He'd rather manipulate the rules of the debate than admit he misunderstood. But what he doesn't see is that every time he refuses to acknowledge his faults, he's not preserving his strength, he's advertising his insecurity. Machiavelli would have called him dangerous, because a man who cannot admit he's wrong cannot evolve. And a man who cannot evolve becomes a tyrant or a fool. The need to always be right is not a display of wisdom, it's a confession of fear. Fear of losing control, fear of appearing weak, fear of being exposed as unsure in a world that demands certainty. The wise man sees growth in the ability to say, "I was mistaken." But the fool clings to his viewpoint like a man drowning clings to driftwood, no matter how broken, no matter how much it pulls him under. Real power doesn't come from being right all the time. It comes from knowing when to surrender, when to listen, and when to step back. The fool sees surrender as defeat. The wise man knows it's the beginning of transformation. The blindness that makes you a pawn. One of the most dangerous traits of a fool isn't just what he says, it's what he fails to see. A fool cannot read people. He lives trapped inside his own perspective, projecting his emotions, thoughts, and intentions onto others. He assumes that everyone thinks like he does, feels what he feels, and wants what he wants. And in doing so, he walks into traps with his eyes wide open, convinced he's in control when he's merely being used. He misses subtle cues. He doesn't notice the quiet shift in someone's tone, the hesitation behind a smile, the tension beneath polite silence. He speaks when he should listen. He pushes when he should retreat. He trusts those who manipulate him and resents those who try to protect him. And in the game of power, where perception is often more important than truth, this kind of blindness isn't just naive, it's fatal. Machiavelli would have seen such a man as the perfect target. A pawn, Not because he lacks intelligence, but because he lacks relational intelligence, the ability to see beyond words, to interpret silence, to read the energy beneath the surface. The fool thinks the truth lies in what people say. The wise man knows the truth often hides in what they don't. Without this skill, the fool becomes predictable, easily provoked, easily deceived. He walks straight into betrayal, never seeing it coming, then blames fate for what his perception could have prevented. But the wise man, he watches, he feels, he senses. He listens not just with his ears, but with presence. He sees what's not being said, and that awareness becomes his armor. The fool is blind because he refuses to look deeper. The wise man sees because he dares to be still. A slave to emotion. When reaction replaces reason. The fourth mark of a fool is his emotional reactivity. He doesn't feel emotions, he is them. His anger, fear, pride, or jealousy don't rise and pass through him, they own him. He reacts before he reflects. One look, one word, one perceived insult, and he erupts, lashing out, shutting down, or spiraling into chaos. He mistakes intensity for power, believing that showing how strongly he feels is a sign of strength. But it's not. It's the loud confession of a man who has no command over himself. A truly powerful man doesn't scream, he doesn't panic, he doesn't explode when provoked. He observes, he breathes, he waits. Not because he's numb, but because he's sovereign over his own inner world. Machiavelli understood that the man who cannot govern himself will never govern anything else. Emotional reactivity is not just a weakness, it's a vulnerability. Because when others know how to push your buttons, they don't need to break you, they just trigger you. And you'll destroy yourself. The fool believes that expressing every emotion makes him authentic. But in reality, it makes him predictable, easily manipulated, childlike. He lashes out in conflict, sulks when ignored, or plays the victim when confronted. And each time he does, he reveals the exact pressure points others can exploit. True wisdom is found in the space between emotion and action, in that breath of silence where you choose who you are. The wise man feels deeply but moves deliberately. He doesn't deny emotion, but he refuses to be ruled by it. The fool, however, never pauses long enough to understand what he feels, so he mistakes noise for strength, chaos for power. And in doing so, he becomes a puppet to anyone who knows how to pull his strings. When image replaces identity. The fifth sign of a fool is his obsession with appearance. He doesn't seek truth, he seeks attention. He invests more in how things look than in how things are. His self-worth is shaped not by who he is in silence, but by how others perceive him in public. He polishes his image, curates his words, poses his life like a staged performance, desperate to be seen, even if what is seen is a lie. He chases admiration like a drug addicted to validation. But beneath the surface, he's empty. He appears confident, but cannot sit in silence. He appears wise, but crumbles under solitude. He appears happy, but it's a happiness borrowed from likes, applause, and filtered approval. Machiavelli would have seen this man not as strong, but as deeply vulnerable, because when your identity is built on how others see you, you hand them the power to define you and to destroy you. The fool believes that visibility equals value, that if he's noticed, he must matter, that if he shouts loud enough, someone will finally confirm that he exists. But all of this is performance, and performance is exhausting. The wise man, on the other hand, builds in silence. He doesn't seek to impress, he seeks to grow. He doesn't decorate his soul with trends. He deepens it through truth. He knows that real power isn't loud, and real confidence doesn't beg to be seen. The fool confuses style with substance, and when the crowd stops clapping, he collapses, because he never built a self, only a persona. What he doesn't realize is this: the more you try to be admired by everyone, the further you drift from who you really are. And eventually the mask cracks, revealing not a king, but a hollow man, afraid of being unseen. The man who cannot be corrected will eventually collapse. The sixth sign of a fool is his inability to receive criticism. He doesn't hear feedback as guidance, he hears it as an attack. Even the gentlest suggestion, the quietest mirror, feels like a threat to the fragile identity he's built. He surrounds himself with flatterers, not challengers. He prefers to be praised for staying the same than confronted with the need to grow. He mistakes discomfort for disrespect. He calls truth negativity. He pushes away those who love him enough to speak honestly and clings to those who tell him what he wants to hear. But this comfort comes at a cost. He builds a world made of silence, not insight. And in that silence, the blind spots grow. Machiavelli knew a ruler who silences his critics invites his own downfall. A man who cannot tolerate contradiction is not strong, he's insecure. Because it takes courage to face your flaws and humility to evolve from them. The fool has neither. He shuts the door on correction and locks himself inside a shrinking reality. What he doesn't see is that rejection of criticism isn't strength, it's stagnation. And stagnation over time becomes collapse. He thinks he's being respected when in truth people have simply stopped engaging. Not out of agreement, but out of exhaustion. The wise man understands that criticism, though uncomfortable, is a gift. It is the friction that sharpens character, the mirror that keeps pride in check. He welcomes it not because he enjoys pain, but because he desires growth more than comfort. The fool, however, rejects all correction. And in doing so, he rejects his own evolution. He chooses the illusion of perfection over the path to wisdom. And slowly, inevitably, he becomes the only one who still believes in the person he's pretending to be. The prisoner who walks in circles. The seventh trait of a fool is his inability to learn from his mistakes. He falls and falls again in the exact same place. Not because life is cruel, but because he refuses to pause and reflect. Every failure is seen as bad luck. Every disappointment is someone else's fault. He trips, blames the ground, and walks forward blindly, only to stumble again. Over time, his life becomes a loop of repeated pain dressed in different circumstances. The wise man sees in every failure a message, a mirror, a chance to refine. But the fool refuses to look. He calls pain unfair instead of listening to what it's trying to teach him. He doesn't grow, he just survives. And survival without awareness is not strength, it's stagnation. Machiavelli would have seen this as one of the most dangerous kinds of ignorance. Not a lack of intelligence, but a refusal of introspection. Because the man who never questions himself can never improve. And the man who cannot improve becomes a burden to himself and to others. The fool stays loyal to habits that harm him. He clings to relationships that drain him. He repeats decisions that break him, and he wonders why nothing changes. He confuses stubbornness with loyalty, pride with principle, and comfort with truth. But deep down, he knows something isn't working. He just lacks the courage to confront it. The wise man rewrites the script. He sees mistakes not as shame, but as signal. He adjusts. He transforms. But the fool, he defends the same failing patterns until they bury him. Not because life punishes him, but because he refuses to listen when life whispers, "Not this way." And so he becomes his own jailer, living behind the rusted bars of decisions he refuses to examine. The shallow mind that fears stillness. The eighth mark of a fool is his contempt for depth. He's impatient with complexity, allergic to silence, and easily bored when conversations drift beyond the surface. He wants quick answers, simple truths, and instant results. But life doesn't work that way, and neither does wisdom. To truly understand something, you must linger with it. But the fool can't stay still long enough to feel a thought, let alone question it. He reads headlines, not books. He parrots opinions not because he understands them, but because they're popular. He prefers sound bites over substance. And in doing so, he builds a mind made of echoes, loud but hollow. Machiavelli would have called this man not ignorant, but lazy. Because ignorance can be cured with effort, but the fool avoids effort entirely. He fears what lies beneath, not because he doesn't care, but because he suspects there's something down there he won't like. A doubt, a contradiction, a wound. So instead of diving into his inner world, he skims across it, always moving, never absorbing. What he doesn't realize is that his fear of depth is what keeps him lost. because the answers he seeks, the peace, the clarity, the strength, aren't on the surface. They live in the quiet places, in the uncomfortable pauses, in the truths that require solitude to hear. The wise man slows down. He listens longer. He asks the questions others are too distracted to consider. And that's why he grows not in noise, but in depth. But the fool, he keeps running. From silence, from solitude, from himself. And in that restless sprint toward distraction, he leaves behind the very thing that could have changed everything, his own ability to go deeper. The man who thinks with the crowd has no mind of his own. The ninth trait of a fool is his dependence on popular opinion. He doesn't truly think he reflects what the crowd thinks. His beliefs are borrowed, his values recycled, his outrage orchestrated by whatever is trending that week. He doesn't ask, "Is this true?" He asks, "Is this accepted?" And in doing so, he becomes a shadow of culture, not a mind within it. To the fool, the majority equals truth. If everyone applauds it, it must be right. If everyone condemns it, it must be wrong. But Machiavelli knew the danger of this instinct. The masses are not always wise. They are often loud, reactive, and blind. And those who think with the masses are carried wherever the wind blows, unable to stand when the storm requires solitude. The fool fears being excluded, misunderstood, or unpopular. So he blends in. He adopts the slogans, shares the outrage, changes his opinions as quickly as the algorithm demands. But in trying to belong everywhere, he ends up rooted nowhere. His identity becomes flexible to the point of being invisible. The wise man, however, is willing to stand alone. He understands that solitude is often the price of clarity. He does not fear being different. He fears betraying what is true just to be liked. The fool is a prisoner of perception. He lives and dies by approval. His self-worth rises and falls with the volume of applause. But when the crowd turns, as it always does, he collapses because he never learned to think in silence. True freedom begins when you stop asking what others think and start asking what you believe. And that journey, lonely at first, is the only path to becoming someone the crowd can never manipulate again. The hollow life lived for applause. The 10th and most tragic trait of a fool is his desperate need to exist through the eyes of others. He does not live from within, he lives from outside in. Every action, every word, every belief he holds is filtered through a single silent question. What will they think of me? He performs rather than lives. He showcases a life, but never inhabits one. He smiles for the camera, not because he's joyful, but because he's terrified of disappearing. This man builds a fragile self constructed from likes, compliments, and validation. He chases visibility like oxygen. If he's seen, he feels real. If he's ignored, he feels erased. And this dependency is not harmless. It's spiritual suffocation. The applause of the crowd becomes his heartbeat. And when the crowd turns quiet, he collapses because he never built an identity that could stand without attention. Machiavelli would have seen this need as fatal. A man obsessed with being liked cannot lead, cannot influence, and cannot evolve. Why? Because he'll always bend, always adapt, always trade truth for approval. He becomes what others want, not who he really is. And over time, he forgets where the performance ends and the self begins. The wise man. He may walk alone, but he walks with peace. He does not perform, he embodies. He does not seek to impress, he seeks to align with what is real, even when it's invisible. The fool, however, sacrifices everything for applause and ends up with nothing, because applause fades. And when it does, he is left staring into the void of a life performed but never lived. You do not need to be seen to be real. You need to be rooted. And until you break free from the hunger for approval, you will never truly know who you are. Foolishness isn't stupidity, it's spiritual blindness. The first hidden truth is the most unsettling. Foolishness isn't about low intelligence, it's about low lucidity. The true fool isn't always the one with poor grades or limited vocabulary. In fact, he may hold degrees, quote, philosophers, or speak eloquently in public. But intelligence in its raw form is not wisdom, and it is certainly not self-awareness. The real measure of wisdom isn't how much you know, it's how clearly you see yourself. Foolishness begins the moment a man stops observing his own patterns. He doesn't question his reactions, his beliefs, or his fears. He assumes his perceptions are truth. His emotions are fact and his judgments are flawless. And that assumption, that silent refusal to turn inward, is what slowly rots his clarity. The fool doesn't lack data. He lacks honesty with himself. Machiavelli understood that the most dangerous fools are not always ignorant. They're the ones too clever to ever admit they could be wrong. These are the people who speak well but never listen, who analyze others but never self-reflect. They hide behind intellect as a mask, hoping it will protect them from the pain of facing their inner distortions. Lucidity, however, demands courage. It means staring into the mirror without flinching. It means recognizing that some of your most cherished ideas may be lies you've told yourself to feel safe. The fool avoids this process because it's uncomfortable, because it threatens his ego, because it threatens the narrative he's built. But the wise man is willing to look, to question, to break, because he knows that real growth only begins when illusion ends. And until a man dares to confront the invisible within himself, all his intelligence is just noise, polished, impressive, but ultimately blind, when kindness becomes a mask for cowardice. The second hidden truth is subtle, and that's what makes it dangerous. Foolishness often disguises itself as kindness. The fool isn't always loud, arrogant, or disruptive. Sometimes he's the one who smiles too much, agrees with everything, and avoids conflict at all costs. People call him nice, easygoing, or harmless. But under that surface lies something far more troubling: a man who confuses comfort with goodness and fear with virtue. He says yes when he means no. He stays silent when injustice speaks. He avoids confrontation, not because he is wise, but because he is terrified of rejection. He would rather betray what is right than risk being disliked. And this constant self-erasure doesn't come from compassion, it comes from a lack of backbone. Machiavelli would not have admired such a man. He would have seen him as an accomplice to chaos. Because when someone refuses to set boundaries, refuses to say no, refuses to stand up for what matters, they become fertile ground for manipulation. Cowardice in disguise is still cowardice, and it silently enables harm to thrive. The fool believes that by avoiding friction, he's preserving peace. But real peace is not the absence of conflict, it's the presence of integrity. And integrity often requires confrontation, clarity, and the courage to be disliked. The wise man can be kind, but his kindness has teeth. He knows how to say no gently, how to protect what is right without rage, and how to draw lines without hate. The fool, however, hides behind a smile, and in doing so, he loses his voice, his dignity, and eventually, his sense of self. True kindness is rooted in strength. But when kindness is used to avoid discomfort, it becomes nothing more than a mask worn by a man too afraid to truly stand. When emotion becomes the master. The third hidden truth is both personal and universal. The fool doesn't just feel emotions, he becomes them. He confuses what he feels with what is true. If he's angry, then someone must be wrong. If he's anxious, then danger must be near. If he's offended, then injustice must have occurred. He cannot separate the inner storm from the outer world, and so every emotion becomes a fact, every reaction a moral stance. This is not sensitivity, it's entrapment. To Machiavelli, this kind of man was dangerous not just to others but to himself, because when emotion is king, reason becomes its prisoner. The fool refuses to question what he feels. He doesn't pause. He doesn't reflect. He simply reacts, and that reaction becomes identity. I feel it, so I am it. But this is where the tragedy begins. Because feelings, while deeply human, are not infallible. They are weather patterns, not laws. And a man who treats every passing storm like an absolute truth will never know calm. He'll lash out in conflict and call it self-respect. He'll withdraw in fear and call it intuition. He'll burn bridges and call it authenticity. But what he's really doing is surrendering to chaos, allowing whatever emotion rises to dictate who he is and what he does. The wise man doesn't reject emotion. He respects it, but from a distance. He knows emotion is information, not instruction. He listens to it, examines it, then chooses his path with intention. The fool cannot do this. He doesn't feel, he fuses. And until he learns to observe his feelings instead of worshiping them, he will remain a puppet to whatever noise rises inside him, mistaking it all for truth when in reality it's just another storm passing through an unguarded soul. The crowd doesn't make you wiser, it makes you louder. The fourth hidden truth is this: the fool becomes even more foolish in a group. Alone, his confusion is manageable, but when surrounded by a crowd, it multiplies. Why? Because the crowd gives him false confidence. It removes the burden of thinking and replaces it with imitation. In the group, he laughs louder, reacts faster, judges harsher. He merges with the collective emotion and loses his ability to see, to question, to pause. He thinks he's being brave, but really he's just following momentum. Machiavelli warned against this illusion. The group erases nuance. It flattens doubt. It replaces reflection with reaction. And in that space, the fool thrives not because he's thinking more clearly, but because the crowd hides his blindness. He mistakes being with many as being right. But history is full of crowds that cheered for horror and called it justice. The fool in the group becomes bolder, but not wiser. He adopts the popular outrage, the trending beliefs, the loudest slogans without ever asking, is this true? Is this mine? He's no longer an individual. He's a ripple in a wave he doesn't control. The wise man, however, knows how to step back. He seeks solitude when the noise rises. He listens longer when everyone else is screaming. He dares to hold a quiet conviction when the crowd demands applause. But the fool doesn't want silence. Silence forces him to think, forces him to feel his doubt, forces him to stand on his own, and that more than anything terrifies him. So he chooses the safety of the group, never realizing that in doing so he trades away his freedom, his discernment, and eventually his soul. Because no man can be free if he cannot think without a crowd telling him what to believe. The fool runs not from the world, but from himself. The fifth and final hidden truth is the most profound foolishness is not just mental, it's spiritual. The fool is not merely someone who lacks intelligence. He is someone who refuses to inhabit his own inner life. He is always busy, always distracted, always surrounded by noise, not because he enjoys it, but because he's afraid of what he might hear in the silence. At his core, the fool is not escaping the world, he's escaping himself. Machiavelli didn't speak of spirituality directly, but he understood power, and true power requires inner stillness. But the fool cannot sit alone in a room. He fills every moment with stimulation, endless scrolling, constant chatter, shallow entertainment, because if the noise ever stopped, the questions would rise. Who am I? What am I becoming? What do I fear when the masks come off? The fool avoids these questions like they're poison, but they are not poison. They are the very beginning of awakening. He resists solitude because it forces him to feel what he's buried. He avoids depth because it reveals the gap between the person he pretends to be and the soul he has yet to meet. He trades mystery for comfort, substance for distraction, truth for temporary relief. The wise man, in contrast, walks into the silence. He confronts the abyss. He listens to the voice beneath all voices, the one that doesn't flatter, doesn't lie, doesn't perform. And in that place he becomes anchored. But the fool, he chooses the shallow, noisy path, not because he is incapable, but because he is afraid. Afraid to meet the self he abandoned long ago. And until he returns, until he stops running, he will never know who he truly is, or what he was meant to become. Look at what you believe before it becomes what you are. The first act of transformation is deceptively simple but incredibly rare. Observe your beliefs, not just the loud ones you talk about, but the quiet ones that guide your choices in silence. Ask yourself, what do I believe, and where did it come from? Most people never ask this. They carry beliefs like inherited furniture passed down, never questioned, emotionally familiar, but spiritually heavy. But what if that belief you defend so passionately isn't yours? What if it was planted in you during a moment of fear, shame, or confusion? What if it was never a product of clarity, but a response to survival? That's the danger of unexamined thinking. It doesn't just distort your view of the world, it becomes your world. The fool never questions his beliefs. He argues, he shouts, he repeats, but he never investigates. Because investigation takes courage. It means risking the collapse of the identity you've built on top of assumptions. But without that collapse, there is no transformation, only repetition. Machiavelli knew if you don't rule your own mind, someone else will. And today it's not tyrants who enslave you. It's your own unconscious programming. Your need to be right. Your inherited guilt. Your avoidance of contradiction. The unspoken rules you follow because that's just how it is. The wise man slows down and looks within. He holds up each belief and asks, is this true, or just comfortable, useful, or outdated? He knows the first step to freedom is not thinking more, but thinking differently. And sometimes that begins by realizing that certainty isn't strength. It's often the disguise of a frightened mind. To observe your beliefs is to begin the most honest conversation of your life, the one where the masks fall and the real questions finally begin. When you stop needing to win, you finally begin to see. The second act of inner transformation is this: learn to separate truth from validation. Most people don't. Most people don't actually want to see clearly, they just want to be agreed with. They confuse applause with wisdom, praise with correctness, and comfort with clarity. And so they live in a performance, never realizing that validation is often a mask that hides truth, not a path that leads to it. The fool believes he's right when people cheer. He feels powerful when he wins arguments. He assumes that agreement equals insight. But what he doesn't see is this: sometimes the truth shows up alone in the quiet moment when no one claps, when everyone resists it, because truth often wounds before it heals. Machiavelli would have warned against this need for approval, because when your self-worth depends on being right in the eyes of others, you're no longer seeking truth, you're chasing popularity. And that makes you malleable, easy to manipulate, addicted to the echo of your own opinion. The wise man, however, isn't afraid to be misunderstood. He's not afraid to lose the argument. He doesn't flinch when someone disagrees because his aim isn't to dominate, but to grow. He knows that surrendering in a debate is not weakness. It's wisdom. Because sometimes the moment you stop defending your position is the moment you finally start understanding it. There is peace in letting go of the need to win. There is clarity in admitting I don't know. And there is deep transformation in standing with the truth, even when you're standing alone. Because in the end, truth doesn't need applause. It needs space. It doesn't shout to be heard. It waits for someone willing to listen without needing to be validated. See others without losing yourself. The third act of inner transformation is to learn to read people without projecting onto them. This sounds simple, but it's one of the hardest disciplines of the inner life. Most people don't actually see others. They see their expectations of others, their fears, their desires, their wounds. And in doing so, they don't relate. They reflect. They don't connect. They assume. The fool walks into every interaction carrying a mirror, not a window. He interprets silence as rejection, kindness as manipulation, disagreement as threat, because he sees not what is, but what he fears might be. And in that haze of projection, he trusts the wrong people, doubts the right ones, and sabotages what could have been real. Machiavelli would have called this a fatal blindness in the game of power. Because when you can't read people clearly, you can't protect yourself. You can't lead. You can't choose wisely. You become easy to deceive and quick to misjudge. But the wise man learns to listen with his full presence. He quiets the noise inside long enough to sense what the other person isn't saying. He hears the tension behind their laughter, the pain behind their pride. He notices what others miss because he's not distracted by his own emotional projections. To do this, you must practice stillness. You must ask, not just what is this person saying, but why now in this way and with this energy. You must be honest about what parts of you are coloring the lens you're using to observe them. When you stop projecting, you begin to perceive. And perception, not reaction, is what protects your spirit in a world full of masks. To truly see someone without distortion is not just strategy, it's a form of love. And love at its highest form begins with clarity. You are not your storm. You are the sky that holds it. The fourth act of inner transformation is learning to channel your emotions instead of being ruled by them. The fool believes that what he feels is what's real. He confuses emotion with truth, reaction with wisdom, and intensity with legitimacy. So when anger rises, he strikes. When fear stirs, he runs. When sadness touches him, he drowns. He's not living, he's reacting. A prisoner of every mood, a servant to every internal shift. But emotion is not your enemy. It's your compass if you know how to read it. Machiavelli warned that a man who cannot master his own passions will always be mastered by others. The world doesn't need to break you if it can simply push your buttons. And those buttons, they're always exposed in the emotionally reactive. All it takes is a word, a glance, a tone, and the fool unravels. The wise man, however, creates space. He feels, but he doesn't become the feeling. He can hold anger without exploding, sit with fear without fleeing, allow sadness without collapsing. Why? Because he's built the muscle of observation. He doesn't silence his emotions, he studies them. He breathes into them. He lets them rise like a wave, and then he chooses how to move. This is not suppression, it's sovereignty. To channel your emotions means to let them inform you without enslaving you. It's knowing that rage doesn't make you powerful, it makes you vulnerable. That tears aren't weakness, but ignoring them is. That joy isn't just pleasure, it's alignment. The fool rides every wave and calls it destiny. The wise man becomes the shore. You are not your storm. You are the sky that holds it all. And the moment you learn to pause, breathe, and choose, that is the moment you become free. Don't react, descend. The fifth act of inner transformation is this: when you're triggered, don't react, go deeper. The fool explodes at the surface. The wise man descends beneath it. Most people never learn to pause between stimulus and response. A word offends them, a gesture unsettles them, a situation catches them off guard, and before they've even understood why they feel disturbed, they're already reacting. Speaking, blaming, escaping. But reaction without reflection is the birthplace of regret. Machiavelli would have seen this moment, the space between impact and impulse, as sacred. Because that's where power lives. Not in the heat of the moment, but in the quiet beneath it. The fool responds fast because he needs relief. The wise man delays because he seeks truth. When something stirs you, anger, sadness, anxiety, don't ask how to fix it right away. Ask instead, what is this really touching in me? Is it fear of rejection, old shame, unspoken grief? That inquiry requires stillness, and stillness requires courage, because not everything that provokes you is about the present moment. Often it's the echo of something unresolved. The fool thinks that by reacting instantly he's taking control. But he's not. He's being controlled by his need to defend, prove, or escape. And so his life becomes a cycle of emotional firefighting, always urgent, never rooted. The wise man does something radical. He slows down. He stays with the discomfort. He doesn't seek quick solutions, but honest confrontation. He lets the pain speak, not to punish himself, but to understand. And in that depth, transformation begins. Because when you stop reacting and start listening, you'll find that the thing you feared the most often held the wisdom you needed the most. Don't react to pain. Descend into it. That's where the breakthrough lives. The courage to think without a crowd. The sixth act of inner transformation is perhaps the most difficult in the modern world. Learn to think alone. Not alone in silence, but alone in conviction. Most people borrow their thoughts from the group. They inherit opinions like they inherit furniture, unquestioned, outdated, but emotionally familiar. They speak not from clarity, but from the need to belong. The fool fears thinking differently. He dreads exclusion. So he merges with the majority, echoes the loudest voices, adapts his views to stay liked. He believes he's thinking, but really he's agreeing. And that agreement often costs him the only thing that makes thought powerful: authenticity. Machiavelli understood this danger. He knew the crowd doesn't reward independent thinkers, it resists them. The man who sees clearly is often the man who stands alone, first in solitude, then in strength. The wise man knows how to sit with contradiction. He doesn't rush to pick a side just because the crowd demands it. He considers. He listens. He disagrees calmly, deeply, sometimes silently. And that silence becomes his shield, because his mind is not for sale. To think alone is not arrogance, it is discipline. It means holding a belief even when it's unpopular. It means standing in truth even when no one claps. It means resisting the intoxicating pull of approval long enough to ask, do I actually believe this? Or do I just fear the consequences of not believing it? The fool craves agreement. The wise man craves clarity. And clarity only comes when you're willing to let go of borrowed thoughts and risk walking alone. Because in that solitude, a stronger mind is born, one that cannot be manipulated, one that cannot be bought, one that doesn't tremble when the world shouts. It thinks not because it's told to, but because it must. Face the void or be ruled by it. The seventh and final act of inner transformation is the most powerful and the most avoided. Confront the void within you. Most people spend their lives running from it. They stay busy, loud, distracted, not because they're fulfilled, but because they're afraid of what will rise when the noise stops. The fool is not simply shallow by nature, he's shallow by choice, because depth requires stillness, and stillness reveals the truth he doesn't want to meet himself. This void is not emptiness, it is unprocessed existence. It holds the grief you buried, the questions you feared, the desires you silenced. It is the place behind the performance, beneath the ambition, beyond the roles you play. And when you finally sit with it, no phone, no crowd, no escape, you begin to remember who you were before the world told you who to be. Machiavelli never used spiritual language, but he understood something timeless. If you don't face what's inside you, someone else will use it to control you. The unexamined self is always vulnerable to trends, to fear, to manipulation. The wise man doesn't flee the void, he walks into it. He knows that real clarity begins when all illusions fall away, that to become grounded, he must first be stripped, that the silence you fear most may be the only place your soul has room to speak. The fool runs from the void and becomes it, empty, performed, forgettable. But the man who dares to face it becomes something else entirely, still, rooted, unshakable. Because when you confront the void, you discover it was never trying to swallow you, it was trying to introduce you to the person you were always meant to become.